Hugo de Groot, 1621, Loevestein Castle, Netherlands. Hugo de Groot was a scholar, a lawyer, and apparently someone who made powerful enemies, because in 1619 the Dutch government threw him in a castle prison and told him he'd be there for life. His wife Maria was allowed to visit and bring him books, which she did regularly in a large wooden chest. Every few days the chest would come in full and leave empty. Guards checked it for a while, then they stopped, because it was just books, and books are heavy and nobody was escaping in a book chest. That's what they thought. After 2 years of watching this routine play out, Maria and Hugo hatched the plan. He climbed in, she sealed it shut, and he was carried out by 2 servants past every guard in the building. He made it to France, reunited with Maria, and lived freely for the rest of his life. The most educated man in the prison escaped inside the one thing the guards assumed was too boring to check. William Maxwell, 1716, Tower of London. Maxwell had backed the losing side of a Scottish rebellion, which in 1716 meant a date with the executioner. He was sitting in the Tower of London the night before his scheduled beheading when his wife Winifred showed up with a group of female friends for what was supposed to be a final farewell visit. What followed was one of the more calm and deliberate escapes in history. The women helped Maxwell into a petticoat, a cloak, and a hood. He practiced walking. Then the group of women simply left the cell together, strolled through the corridors, and walked out of the tower. Guards saw a group of ladies leaving after a visit. Nobody looked twice. Maxwell made it out of England, crossed into Europe, and eventually settled in Rome with his wife, who also had to flee after her role became obvious. He lived another 33 years. The man escaped beheading the day before it was scheduled by borrowing his wife's coat. John Sheppard, 1724, London. Jack Sheppard was 22 years old, worked as a carpenter's apprentice, and escaped prison 4 times in a single year. The first 2 times he used iron bars, nail files, and sheer stubbornness. The third time he was locked in a cell called the Castle, the most secure room in Newgate Prison, with 300 pounds of iron chains bolted to the floor. He was there for 3 days. On the 3rd night, he worked a link loose from his chains, used the metal to pick through 6 consecutive locked doors in complete darkness, climbed to the roof, lowered himself down using his blankets, and dropped into the city. The guards found an empty room with a neat pile of broken chains in the morning. By then, he was already in a pub. Londoners loved him for it. They visited him in jail like tourists. They bought portraits of him. He was hanged eventually, in front of a crowd of 200,000 people, most of whom were there because they were fans. He was a celebrity who happened to also be a criminal, or maybe the other way around. Libby Prison, February 1864, Richmond, Virginia. Libby Prison was a converted tobacco warehouse in the heart of Confederate Richmond. They crammed over 1,000 Union officers inside it and let the place deteriorate. It was cold, it was filthy, and rats ran across sleeping men at night. A small group of officers decided the only way out was through the floor. They started digging in the fall of 1863, working in shifts, moving dirt in small amounts to avoid detection. The first 3 tunnels collapsed or flooded. The 4th one held. They dug 50 feet through wet, rat-infested ground and came out the other side of a fence. On the night of February 9th, 109 men crawled through that tunnel one by one and walked into the Confederate city. Then they had to get home. Most of them used the North Star to navigate north through enemy territory, hiding during the day, moving at night. 59 made it to Union lines. 48 were recaptured. 2 drowned crossing the James River. The ones who survived pulled off one of the most physically demanding escape stories in American history, and they did it because someone was willing to dig through mud with rats on their back for 4 months. John Dillinger, March 1934, Crown Point Jail, Indiana. The Crown Point Jail was being publicly called escape-proof before Dillinger even arrived. Newspaper photographers showed up to take pictures of the place. Officials gave tours. Dillinger sat inside all of this and carved a piece of wood into the shape of a gun. He spent days working on it, darkening it with shoe polish until it looked convincingly real. Then one morning he walked out of his cell holding it, bluffed his way through a room full of guards, locked several of them inside a cell, grabbed a real gun he found along the way, released some other prisoners to create chaos, and walked out the back. He took the sheriff's car. He drove it across state lines, which added a federal charge to everything else. Months later, he was shot dead by the FBI outside a movie theater in Chicago. But between the escape and the end, he robbed several more banks, which is a very Dillinger way to spend borrowed time. Alcatraz, June 11th, 1962, San Francisco Bay. Frank Morris and brothers Clarence and John Anglin had been planning their escape for over a year. The idea was simple, and the execution was insane. They chiseled through the back walls of their cells using spoons and a makeshift drill made from a vacuum cleaner motor, working at night, hiding the holes with cardboard painted to match the wall. They stockpiled raincoats. They sewed them together using an improvised needle and contact cement until they had enough to build a raft. They carved dummy heads from soap and plaster, painted them, added real human hair from the prison barber shop, and placed them in their beds to fool the nightly flashlight checks. On the night of June 11th, they crawled through the ventilation system, climbed to the roof, scaled down the side of the building, and launched into the San Francisco Bay. The water was around 50 degrees. The current was brutal. They were never seen again. The FBI kept the case open for decades. In 2013, a letter appeared claiming one of the Anglins had lived to old age in South America. Nobody's confirmed it. The official position is that they drowned, but their bodies were never found, which means the most famous prison escape in American history has no confirmed ending. The Maze Prison, September 25th, 1983, Belfast. This wasn't a prison break. It was a coordinated military operation that happened to take place inside a prison. The maze held some of the most high-profile IRA prisoners in Northern Ireland, behind concrete walls, watchtowers, and multiple security checkpoints. Over months, the prisoners smuggled 6 firearms into the facility. On the day of the escape, they used those guns to overpower guards inside H7 block, take them hostage, and seize control of the entire wing. Then they waited for the food delivery truck. When it arrived, they loaded 38 men into the back and pointed a gun at the driver. The truck pulled up to the main gate exactly as it did every day. Guards waved it through. It drove out of the most secure prison in Europe, carrying nearly 40 prisoners, and nobody outside the vehicle knew. 19 were caught almost immediately. The other 19 scattered across Ireland, England, and mainland Europe. It remains the largest prison escape in British history, and it worked because one food truck looked the same as every other food truck. Michel Vaujour, May 1986, Paris. Michel Vaujour was serving 27 years for armed robbery. His wife Nadine, who was devoted to him in the most extreme sense of the word, decided she was going to get him out. She spent months quietly taking helicopter flying lessons without telling anyone why. Meanwhile, Michel was inside painting nectarines to look like grenades. On the day of the escape, he pulled the painted fruit on a guard, forced his way up to the prison roof, and stood there waiting. Nadine flew in over the walls, landed on the roof, and Michel climbed in. They landed in a football field nearby and disappeared into Paris. He was shot and seriously wounded during a robbery a few months later. Nadine was arrested. Both were back in prison within the year. But the man got off a rooftop using a nectarine, picked up by his wife who had learned to fly a helicopter specifically for this. And for a few months it worked. Frank Abagnale, 1971, Atlanta Federal Prison. Abagnale was a professional liar. He had spent years impersonating a pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer without any credentials in any of those fields. When he finally ended up in a U.S. federal prison, he treated it the same way he treated everything else, as a performance. When a marshal accidentally forgot to bring his detention papers on intake day, Abagnale recognized the opening. At that time, the Justice Department was conducting undercover inspections of federal prisons for civil rights violations, using agents posing as inmates. Abagnale told staff he was one of those inspectors. He spent weeks acting the part, cooperative, observant, asking the right questions. The guards started treating him differently, better. They thought they were under evaluation. Eventually, they helped him walk out of the building so he could meet his supposed partner outside. He was gone for 2 months before being caught again. He didn't dig a tunnel or build a weapon. He just talked to people, and they believed him. Redoine Faid, 2013 and 2018, France. Faid is on this list twice because he apparently found prison escaping more interesting than staying out of prison. The first time, in 2013, his associates smuggled weapons and explosives inside. He took guards hostage, blasted through 5 security doors with the explosives, and drove away in a waiting car. He was caught within weeks and given an extra decade on top of his existing sentence. He responded to this by planning a bigger escape. In 2018, 3 of his associates hijacked a helicopter at gunpoint, forced the pilot to fly to the Redoine prison south of Paris, and landed directly in the courtyard. They deployed smoke grenades, used angle grinders to cut through the outer wall of the visiting area, and pulled Faid out in under 10 minutes while guards were still trying to understand what was happening. They burned the getaway car in a mall parking lot and switched vehicles. He was on the run for 3 months before police found him in an apartment north of Paris. He is currently back in prison. It is unclear what the third attempt will involve. El Chapo, July 11, 2015. Altiplano, Prison, Mexico. El Chapo had already escaped from a Mexican prison once, in 2001, reportedly in a laundry cart, so the authorities knew who they were dealing with. When he was recaptured in 2014, they put him in Altiplano, the most fortified prison in the country. They watched him constantly. What they didn't watch was what was happening outside, about a mile away, where his cartel had quietly purchased a house and started digging. The tunnel took months and cost millions. It was 5,500 feet long, tall enough to stand in, fitted with lighting, ventilation, and a rail system. When it was ready, El Chapo walked into his shower, stepped through a pre-cut hole in the floor, and got on a motorcycle that was waiting underground. He rode it out of prison along a tunnel his people had spent over a year building, and emerged in a half-constructed house in the middle of the night. He was on the run for 6 months before being caught again. He is now in a Supermax facility in Colorado. The shower floor is presumably concrete. If this helped you understand, hit that like button. Subscribe for more true crime and dark history explained simply. Thanks for watching.